Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, and I am director of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled State Legislative Oversight and the Pandemic, Conducting Oversight on Emergency Government Contracts. We are so pleased to bring this important topic to you today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone in attendance today is staying healthy and safe. While we are honored to be able to hold this virtual event with panelists and audience members from around the country, we do look forward to the day when we can again choose to hold such gatherings in person. Hopefully that will be very soon. I'm going to briefly describe the Levin Center and why today's panel on oversight of emergency contracts is so timely and important to our mission. Then I will turn things over to Ben Ike of the Levin Center, who will introduce our panelists and serve as our moderator. Now, a word about the Levin Center. Former Senator Carl Levin founded the Levin Center in 2015 upon his retirement from the United States Senate, where he served for 36 years. The Levin Center is headquartered at Wayne State University's Law School in Detroit. We also have a Washington, D.C. office. The mission of the Levin Center is to advance bipartisan, fact-based oversight and civil discourse as instruments of change. At a time when our country and our society and our politics are so deeply divided, we at the Levin Center believe that common ground can be found by working across party lines to pursue important facts and hold the government accountable for keeping its promises. That's what we're here to do today, and we are here to help legislators around the country do just that. We pursue this mission through trainings and workshops with members and staff in Congress and in state legislatures. We do research and teaching and commentary, and our website and social media posts and podcasts are designed to provide oversight researchers and practitioners and the public a one-stop resource for all things related to legislative oversight. Today, we are gathered to learn about the work that state legislators are doing to conduct oversight of government contracts, particularly emergency contracts authorized to respond to the pandemic. This discussion grows out of research that the Levin Center performed and a report we issued in November of 2020. That report was written by Elise Bean of the Levin Center and Tyler Langley. The report focused on 3 case studies of state legislative oversight of emergency COVID response contracts in 10 states. Emergencies are often a time when executive power is at its peak. Governors in most states are authorized in emergencies to issue special orders, enter no-bid contracts, and take other steps to respond quickly to an emergency. It is especially important then for legislatures to conduct oversight of these actions. Our report found significant problems with a number of these contracts, including unreliable contractors, excessive prices, substandard goods or services, delayed deliveries, and a lack of transparency. We also found that legislative oversight around the country was uneven and in some cases non-existent when it came to government contracts and emergency contracts. But we also discovered numerous ways that state legislatures were conducting in-depth and very impactful oversight. And we discovered ways that these lawmakers were improving the way they responded to the oversight of government contracts and the opportunity to do that oversight. We have joining us today 3 lawmakers who play particularly important roles in those efforts. And we look forward to hearing about their experiences and challenges and opportunities that legislatures across the country confront when overseeing government contracts during this pandemic. Speaking as a former member of the Michigan House of Representatives, where I served as vice chair of the Oversight Committee, I know it can be challenging to conduct in-depth oversight of complex programs. That challenge becomes especially magnified during a pandemic when the lives and livelihoods of Americans are at stake, and we must ensure that hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars are being used properly to address this crisis. So that's why we're here. We're here to help legislators and the public learn about oversight and ways it can improve governance in our country. With that, I want to turn things over to Ben Ike, the Levin Center's Manager of State Training and Communications. Ben brings a wealth of experience, having served as a legislative staff member and fellow at the state level and in Congress. He will introduce and moderate our panel. I want to thank you all again, and Ben, take it away.
Sure will. Thanks again, Jim, for that wonderful introduction. So thank you everyone for tuning in and being part of this panel discussion today. As Jim mentioned, my name is Ben Ike, and I manage state training and communications here at the Levin Center. Today, I'm delighted to moderate this panel discussion with 3 state elected leaders from across the country. First, we will hear from State Senator Machaela Cavanaugh from Nebraska, then from Assemblymember David Chiu from California, who is currently in committee. He will join us as soon as he can, and State Senator Dan Johnson from Idaho. After, there will be a Q&A with further questions on state legislative oversight in the pandemic, with hopefully some audience questions as well. Please share questions in the bottom in the Q&A. So again, thank you all for being here and for being part of this panel discussion. Our first panelist is State Senator Machaela Cavanaugh. Senator Cavanaugh is an Omaha native with nearly 20 years of experience in community engagement and public affairs. She represents Legislative District 6 in the Nebraska Legislature, which includes Omaha. In the legislature, she serves on the Health and Human Services Committee and Transportation and Telecommunications Committee. I would now like to welcome Senator Cavanaugh to discuss oversight efforts in Nebraska. Thank you again for being part of this panel.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me today. If I'm not speaking loud enough, please let me know. Sometimes I'm told I'm too soft-spoken.
Sounds good.
I did put together a little PowerPoint. I don't know if I can share my screen or if you have it. Looks like, yep, there we go. So today I'm going to be talking about Nebraska's COVID-19 statewide testing program. It was called, or it still is called, Test Nebraska. It's a contract that we did outside of Nebraska with a company called Nomi Health in Utah. So this is just an overview of the Nebraska oversight into this particular procurement process. You could do the next slide. So I'm going to give just kind of a high level look at how this all came to be, starting with the transparency in the contract, some concerns around access, reliability, the data collection and security, and then the public health engagement. Go to the next slide. So this transparency in the contract, this was a no bid contract. So this happened in April of 2020. Wow, it's 2021 now. April of 2020, we had a contract to do this testing, and nobody knew about it. There was no announcement. There was no RFP. It was it just was announced at a press conference that it had been enacted, and that's how myself, my colleagues, and the health officials across the state found out about our new testing program. There's the next slide. So immediately there were concerns around the access. The testing program has not followed the ADA requirements. You must drive through for testing. And so this has created a lot of obstacles. Additionally, something I don't have on here is the technology necessary. So it was required that you would go online. This was at the start of the pandemic, that you would go online and register, and then you would get tested. You would get like a QR code sent to you. You had to give a lot of personal data at that point in time, and then you would get scheduled and you would go through a drive-through. So you had to have access to the internet, you had to be able to speak English and read English, and you had to have access to a car, a vehicle. If you can go to the next slide. So part of the problem was also early on, there wasn't any transparency in the efficacy of the testing program. We still have questions around false negatives. The people that were enacting the testing to begin with were not trained health professionals, because we weren't using our healthcare infrastructure that we had in the state. And so we were just going with, we had National Guard members doing the testing, and they weren't testing appropriately, putting the swab up far enough, doing it long enough. So we were starting to get a lot of false negatives, and the testing wasn't clear as to how they were what safeguards they had to ensure that it was had an efficacy. And we have here in Nebraska, the University of Nebraska Medical Center, that offered to do testing to ensure that it was effective, but that was declined. And so that, you know, begged a question about transparency in the entire process. The next slide. So that brings us back to the data collection and security. So as I said before, there was a requirement that you go on the website and you fill out a questionnaire, and that it would go to the NOMI Health, which is also partnered with Domo, another analytics company out of Utah. And at the start, there was very little clarity on who owned the data. Eventually, it was stated that the state of Nebraska owned the data, but there still is this outstanding question about if the company that is collecting the data can use it for their own purposes. And to this day, we have not received a adequate or sufficient answer to that question. So while they don't own the data, they might be able to use the data for product development or marketing. It's still very much an outstanding question. In May of 2020, myself and several other senators sent a request to the governor asking that he shift the assessment questionnaire process over to the Nebraska Health Information Exchange, or otherwise known as NEHI, which is already Nebraska's information repository and is HIPAA compliant. We have seen gains in collaboration with that data collection, but it still is not turned over to NEHI. One of the reasons that that is important to me is that NEHI does a lot of social determinants of health studies, and the data that's being collected would be very helpful and useful in ensuring that we are hitting the communities that we really need to be hitting. So next slide, please. So the final piece of this lack of transparency was that there was no consultation with our public health department across the state. It was pretty much from the get-go, our public health departments found out about the contract at the same time that I did, which was watching a press conference. And so a lot of concerns came out of that, and it has been sort of working backwards to include them in the testing program and start to kind of shoehorn our public health departments into that position and that collaboration. And so while we all appreciate that back in April and May of last year, we were desperate to get testing started, it has not worked well since the beginning, and probably should have had more eyes on the contract and more people engaged from the start. I know too many cooks in the kitchen can be a problem, but sometimes you need to have just a few sous chefs. I think the next slide is about, you want to go to the next slide. So then there, additionally, on top of all of the other things that we were faced with, NOMI Health has had a storied history that isn't great. There's a financial relationship between the leadership and the maker of the drug that casts further doubt about the stewardship of the taxpayers' dollars and the sensitive health data that was part of the NOMI leadership. There's another contract involved Domo, and it was headed by a gentleman who both the Bloomberg and the LA Times criticized for using his company as a personal piggy bank, including flying jets and investing in restaurants. And then there continue to be discriminatory complaints against NOMI Health and Domo. The value of the contract, that's a great question, was $27 million to begin with. And 13 million of that was for the actual testing for the supplies. One thing that I had hoped that we would do as a state is step out of the contract part that wasn't the testing supplies, because that was the problem for the state at that point in time, is that we couldn't get access to testing supplies as everyone was having that problem. But we still had the healthcare infrastructure to execute it. And so we really wanted to have that come back in-house. And we've now since developed testing, as everyone has. There's testing at pharmacies, or our medical center has testing. And so we certainly are in a different space than we were a year ago, but it would have been nice to have kind of started from a more collaborative standpoint and certainly had more transparency in the process. I think there's more slides. The next slide, yeah. So these next few slides, and I saw somebody asking about the PowerPoint. Yes, that's fine with me if it's shared. The next few slides are just several. These are all the COVID testing in the news, and there is a significant amount. My computer just said that my internet is unstable, so I hope I have not been frozen on everyone's screen. And so I think that's really it for my quick overview of Test Nebraska. There's a lot of nuances to it all, and I'm sure we'll have questions at the end, so I'm happy to stick around for that.
We'll have questions at the end, and my internet was working fine. I believe, I hope for everybody else that it kind of came through loud and clear. Thank you so much for your presentation, your Senator Cavanaugh. I believe that Assemblymember Chiu is still in committee. He's not appeared yet, so I believe next we will turn it over to Senator Dan Johnson. State Senator Dan Johnson from Idaho is serving his 6th term in the Idaho Legislature. He represents Legislative District 6, which includes Nez Perce County and Lewis County. Did I pronounce that right? Okay. He serves on the Agriculture Committee, Resources and Environment Committee, and Education Committee. I would now like to welcome Senator Dan Johnson to discuss oversight efforts in Idaho. Thank you again for being part of this panel.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Levin Center for taking on this important work and for your leadership. I sincerely appreciate it, and the opportunity I've had to develop a little bit of a relationship with the Levin Center over the last year and a half. I'm going to begin by just giving some broad comments about contracting and then go down quickly into the pandemic contracts. Let me begin by saying that the state of Idaho, we have a pretty robust contracting and purchasing process here in the state led by our Department of Administration. And we also have some very detailed rules on how agencies are supposed to perform in these capacities, and it's monitored very closely, something that we've put a lot of effort into improving over the years, and I think it has paid big dividends for us. But I do want to share with you, because I asked some questions, I asked of them if they had any process in place to monitor these contracts for CARES Act dollars, and the response was that they didn't have anything at the department, that they were going to be working through our state controller's office, and they would be tracking, the controller's office would be tracking everything on what's called Transparent Idaho. And here in just a minute, I'll have Margot load something up for you to look at, and we can talk about that. I also contacted our Legislative Services Office, which in Idaho, we have a team of analysts that work with our Budget Committee folks, but they're also available to other members of the legislature to talk about budget issues or to help look at some of the impacts or analysis on bills, that is fiscal impacts. Asked them the same question about this, and their response back to me was that the controller, that is the state controller's office, was in contact with them from the start to identify areas of need of internal control and oversight from their perspective. So again, everybody's deferring to our state controller's office, which I think is comforting for me as a legislator too, because it tells me that it's going through one channel, and that should help with the consistency of the message and the tracking. There was one exception during the whole time last year that I'm aware of, where we had to maybe suspend some of the rules, but not necessarily detrimental to the state. And that dealt with our Idaho Department of Labor. We were so overwhelmed with unemployment insurance claims and verification of these claims and other types of things that the department has to make, that we had to go out and get some emergency purchasing authority to, and what we did was hire a call center. And the call center was basically there to help field the calls, help folks reset their passwords if there were some other problems that they had, and then just answer some routine questions. So I presume that that contract went well for the state, but again, it was temporary in nature, and I think it was one that was very positive for the state. The heart of what we did during this time was the governor's office set up what's called CFAC, C-F-A-C. It's the Coronavirus Financial Advisory Committee. And that committee was made up of 4 individuals from the governor's office, members of our Division of Financial Management, the state controller's office, and then the Association of Idaho's cities and counties. And this CFAC committee was responsible for kind of being the first intake on any expenditure of funds, and then follow up to that would be the contracts. And so my comments from here on out are really going to focus on transparency as much as they're going to focus on contract administration and oversight. But I think it's very important once I show you some things why I feel that's important. They developed some very detailed outlines of how the committee would operate, how they would review requests for expenditure of funds, which would include contracts that were signed, how personnel costs would be expended, what qualified or not qualified, and then also direct reimbursement of funds that maybe an agency or local municipality had already spent. So with that, Margot, I'd like to ask if you could put that PowerPoint up, and we'll go through that very quickly. Okay, and so there it is. This is what we call our Transparent Idaho, the Coronavirus Relief Fund portal. And it's pretty self-explanatory on this, so I won't read from that. But you can see that we put this out there in a rather short amount of time and tried to set up some accountability for how these funds were going to be spent within the state. Next slide, please. Okay, it's kind of hard to see all of that on my screen, but this, it says here, building the portal. And this talks about how the governor put together his coronavirus relief fund, the distributions, and the path that we took. And if you see that statement there in highlight, in a month, we were able to. And I think this is really a testimony to everyone pulling together here in the state of Idaho and trying to make this work and to be accountable for these dollars, to be responsible to the citizens of this country. So you can see there at the bottom, create a statewide chart of accounts, which was no small task, build a portal for entity registration. This is where cities, counties, others could log in, and they had to report on receipt of funds, expenditure of funds, build the portal, and then begin reporting the funds. Next slide, please. Okay, here's, I want to kind of maybe go through each of these points very carefully, because this, I think, really shows the heart of what we did here in Idaho. And I'm just going to make the assumption that as a state, we continue to do contract monitoring and oversight as we move forward, because really the time is compressed here. It wasn't just a year ago when we started receiving these monies. And you'll see that, and I think it's on this slide here. If not, we'll find another one. But, you know, like all states, we were waiting for direction from the federal government on what qualified and what didn't qualify. So these are the assumptions, if you will, or the tenets of our model. And in the green there, Transparent Idaho has created a standardized chart of accounts. Below that in the gray, Idaho is better prepared to distribute and report this data than other states due to Transparent Idaho functionality. And I think that's true, because this thing is accessible. You can go visit this site when we're done today, and you can just drill down and find out, I mean, almost to the dollar, where this money's going and how it's being spent. So if there were some questions about contract oversight or contract monitoring, you could certainly follow it that way. There's other ways to aggregate the data to find out which contractors were getting, you know, which contracts or funds they were receiving. And so that, I guess, from a legislative standpoint, would allow us to take a look at those things. And maybe if there's something that looked off, it would pique our interest, and we could do some follow-up questions. And we're still doing that. So everything we've done here in Idaho is still going to be subject to our single audit. So we have a lot of eyes looking at this. In the yellow there, Transparent Idaho is currently reporting on 242 categories, far more than the 18 federally required. So again, I think there's some accountability that we're putting into this, some transparency, which again, I think can help with our contract letting and our contract reporting and monitoring. In the red, Transparent Idaho's user-friendly and interactive reports. Again, you can access this, but we're done today. Take a look at that. It's been very helpful. And then down there in the purple, Transparent Idaho will be a clearinghouse for all data. And so I guess what's important about this too is we're finding out now that we have this model in place, and then we begin to have the second and third rounds of these monies coming into the states, it's really been very helpful for us to have this in place. Next slide, please. And so again, this is just kind of a path that we went along, and you see there on the far left, the federal guidance. about the limited guidance that we had and all the states had, and that was a challenge to us. But again, I think with our 242 charts that we put, the accounts that we put out there, it's going to better enable us to respond to any questions that may come from the legislature, the state, or the citizens, but also to provide some contract accountability or some contract oversight as we continue through the audit process and other things, and take a look back on what we did in the past that worked and maybe what didn't work. And then when we move forward, in the green there, the moving target, build this as guidance was constantly changing and evolving. I think there were, if I remember right, 30, 40 changes in guidance over a very short period of time. So that made it very challenging to track some of these funds. But I imagine it was also a challenge for the contracting folks too, in terms of guidelines and following those guidelines. The state initiatives in the red there, often announced to the public with limited guidance. Again, as it says there on the bottom line, they're confused citizens. They were confused, we were confused, but I think we're doing our best to try to be responsible and accountable for all of these monies. And then on the last there, the resources, a team of 6 SCOs, the State Controller's Office employees received, processed, and reported on nearly 3,000 of these requests. And I have to tell you, this team in the State Controller's Office, they were there, they were dedicated full time, and they were very quick to review and to respond on all of these. So again, I think Idaho is going to have a good report card when this whole process is over. And then I think there's one more slide there. There, it just talks about it. So the portal itself. So the federal reporting, again, I think we're in a good position to do that and do that very responsibly, quickly, and then the subrecipient monitoring too. The requirements that we put in place that were federal requirements, but also the state of Idaho, so that we can track that. So that's the end of the PowerPoint on that. I didn't give you a lot of examples about contract oversight and monitoring per se, but I feel very confident with the Transparent Idaho website that we have that some of this contract and oversight may be post, and that is after the contract itself. And there may be some clawback provisions in some of these, but it was the best that we could do in a short amount of time. And I feel very good about what we did as a state. So thank you, Ben.
Very interesting, Senator Johnson. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, especially this Transparency Idaho. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a dive on that site later on myself and taking a look and seeing this good information, good transparency that's available. So at the moment, it appears that Assemblymember Chiu is still in committee, but we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So I think we will, just in the order in which they were first received, Senator Cavanaugh, if you're on, Bob Ackerman is asking, to what extent has the oversight of testing in Nebraska been bipartisan?
Hi, yeah, that is an interesting question. I would say the oversight piece has not been extremely bipartisan. Mostly myself and Senator Megan Hunt have done most of the work into looking into it, which we are both Democrats, so I would say that's not very bipartisan, but our Appropriations Committee did turn a keen eye into procurement, and we are now working together in a bipartisan way on addressing issues with our procurement process, not just in the state of emergency, but writ large. In Nebraska, there's some concerns about how we go about procurement contracts.
Very interesting, thank you. And then it looks like, oh, maybe Assemblymember Chiu is joining. There he is. Hi, Assemblymember Chiu, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. How are we doing?
Perfect. Doing well. We'll save the other question for after this presentation. Thank you for your patience, State Senator Ram Vili-Valam. I'm so bad with pronunciations. I apologize. So, Assemblymember Chiu is up next. As a member of the California State Legislature, Assemblymember David Chiu represents 500,000 constituents in the 17th Assembly District, which encompasses eastern San Francisco. During his first 6 years in the legislature, David has authored laws addressing a wide spectrum of issues, including housing, homelessness, transportation, education, environment, clean energy, health, public safety, and civil rights. He has served as chair of the Assembly Housing and Community Development Committee and the California API Legislative Caucus. I would now like to welcome Assemblymember Chiu to discuss oversight efforts in California. Thank you again for being part of this panel.
Of course, I'm going to say good morning because that's what time it is in California. Let me also just apologize for being late. We're in the midst of the busiest time of our legislative season, and I just cast about 9 votes in the last 14 minutes. So appreciate being able to jump on, and I'm sorry I didn't have the ability to hear the great thoughts of my fellow colleagues around the country. So a couple of just general observations about this time period and this topic, and then I want to just give a little bit of a case study of one of the experiences we've had in California that I suspect has not been unique to our state. But this time period has really showcased for me and many of my colleagues in California just how much more oversight we need to do in general. I think before the pandemic, before the recession, before all of the calamities that have impacted all of our states during this past year, there were a lot of things that that would happen behind closed doors or would get swept under the rug that we didn't need to have, I think, the level of scrutiny that is so critical today. And it's kind of a cliche to say that this pandemic has shown just a bright, hot spotlight on all the things that are broken in society, but particularly when it comes to government, what's not being scrutinized. And certainly, there have been plenty of contracts, both before this pandemic and during this pandemic, that could use an awful lot more scrutiny on so many subjects, from where we're receiving healthcare to how social services are being provided, to how rescue funds are being dispersed to cities and counties. And our legislature, I think it's fair to say, one of the biggest challenges is during this time period, our legislature essentially shut down for a number of months because COVID rates were so intense. And in California, we had chosen to really take a safe rather than being sorry approach. And so our legislature, literally, we were out for a few months where the executive branch was going 120 hours a day and doing a ton of things. And because we weren't able to literally convene, our ability to do oversight, which in general I would suggest is typically challenged, was even more challenged. Our legislature had provided our governor with emergency powers, but I think it's also fair to say for both the executive branch and the legislative branch, we just didn't think through how you give emergency powers, but also ensure real oversight, particularly around contracts. And let me just take a few moments now and talk about one of the biggest kind of, I would say, failures that we have seen that have involved contracts that did not receive the scrutiny that they should. So our California unemployment system, it's run by a department called EDD, which stands for the Employment Development Department. And within a few months of the pandemic, we were hitting backlogs of constituents that were over 1 million. So in other words, 4, 5, 6 months in, over 1 million Californians had not received their unemployment checks, not just for weeks, but for months. So literally referring to billions and billions of dollars of benefits that were owed by desperate constituents who needed to put food on the table or to pay for healthcare or pay for the rent, who literally could not get a word from this department on what was happening to their checks. And at the same time, they would be calling into this department, and literally only 1% of all calls were being answered. Our legislative offices were completely overwhelmed with calls. And it turned out that this particular unemployment system, both the IT side, but also the bureaucracy, had failed during the Great Recession a decade ago, but no one had thought about that until this calamity started. There were 2 contracts that were underpinning parts of the failure of this unemployment system. One was a contract with the international firm Deloitte, who had received $250 million over the course of the past decade, allegedly to modernize what had been an old dysfunctional IT system. And before the pandemic, Deloitte was helping to oversee what was supposed to be a 7-year modernization process. And of course, despite all the money we'd paid them over the course of a decade, that modernization had never happened, had led to the failure that we're talking about. And yet during the pandemic, even after everything I just explained came to light, the state agency, EDD, continued to award no bid contracts to Deloitte. That's a problem. Let me add another major international player, the Bank of America, which had a longstanding contract with EDD to provide debit cards to unemployment benefit recipients. So in other words, if you apply for your unemployment, you would get a Bank of America card that has money in an account that you can withdraw from. Well, it turns out that 5 years ago, because of the lack of scrutiny with regard to oversight, Bank of America chose not to put the typical security chip into those cards. And then all of a sudden, Bank of America with EDD decided to halt over 350,000 Californians from receiving Bank of America cards because we started to see a massive spike in fraud. As we started to investigate this, we realized that there were so many problems with the contract, including the fact the Bank of America continued to make money off of every transaction that was made by our constituents, and the fact that the Bank of America wasn't actually investigating real fraud that was happening to our constituents. So, taking a step back, this is one of the biggest examples of challenges that we have had as a state in California dealing with this, and underpinning this have been, again, 2 contracts with major business players where there has been little accountability and little oversight. The coda to this story is in the last couple of months, when we came back into session, we've held a series of, as you can imagine, excoriating hearings, really exposing what has not been happening. And it has created an entire new conversation of what do we need to really conduct legitimate and comprehensive oversight, not just of contracts, but in general. It's also fair to say that the executive branch, I think they've done an awful lot of work to kind of clean up this mess that this particular, our governor's administration had inherited from years ago. But suffice it to say, my interest in this topic is to really understand and share thoughts and ideas of what we are doing and not doing, so we can really move forward best practices in this space. There's so much more work that needs to be done. And maybe the last observation I'll make is, before I became an elected official, I spent 10 years in the private sector, in part as a general counsel to a company where we had a myriad of contracts that we oversaw, including some with government. And suffice it to say, it appears to me that generally government does a very, very bad job of contract administration in many executive branches, but in particular, legislative branches are just generally not equipped to dive into the details of really following what happens to contracts. How do we ensure that they're well negotiated? How do we ensure that if government is working with outside partners, that those outside partners are actually doing what they should? And inertia, status quo, typically leads to bad contracts being renewed and renewed and renewed at the cost of taxpayers and at the cost of all of us trying to serve our constituents. So a couple high-level thoughts. Maybe I'll turn it back at this point to the moderator.
There we go. There I am. Thank you again, Assemblymember Chiu, for a wonderful presentation. Lots of thoughts that were generated from that, and definitely thinking about contract monitoring and thinking about oversight and some of these responsibilities that state legislatures across the country, including in California, are faced with every day. Thank you so much. At this point, I believe we have a couple of questions that have been put into the Q&A, so we'll get those answered first. One that stood out to me was to all the senators and also Assemblymember Chiu. What is the policy in your respective states regarding no bid contracts? Are there any requirements to publish information about these contracts?
Well, in Nebraska, all of our contracts are published on our Department of Administrative Services website, but there's not a lot of oversight in the bidding process to begin with, but you do have access to the contract after it's been signed. So if it's a state of emergency, which it was for Test Nebraska and which it was for our child welfare contract, they declared it a state of emergency. There's no real guidance on what that means. And then they can do it without putting out a formal bid.
I'll just jump in on behalf of California and say essentially the same thing, particularly during times of emergency and pandemic, when we give the executive branch the ability to move quickly. The administration can enter into no bid contracts, and our recourse is really after the fact to scrutinize those contracts, and it's more of a political PR public conversation at that point as to whether the no bid contract should have been entered into.
Excellent. I see a question that just came in that's also quite interesting to myself as well. How do you handle contract oversight when the legislature is not in session? And I think it's interesting to think about because we have 3 elected officials from 3 quite different states as far as the size of their legislatures, the time in which they are in session. I think it'll be interesting to hear some answers on that.
Well, I'll jump in there quick. And I just quickly back on the other question, our judicial and legislative branches are not covered by the requirements to go out for competitive bidding, just like the constitutional officers don't have that. So we had that very issue here at the start of this session where there was a concern over the total dollar amount, the number of no bid contracts by our superintendent of public instruction. And so even though that position as a constitutional officer is not required to go through that, I think they do some of that and some of it they don't do. So a good example would be a contract maybe that was initially awarded as part of a competitive bid process, but then it was renewed at a later time to maintain some kind of continuity. So let's say with an education bid or something like that, and it kind of saves a little bit on the revolving door process, and or the expense of having to go out and bid those. So, those folks in those positions have to make those decisions. In terms of oversight outside the legislative session, I shared very briefly about the portal that we have here in the state of Idaho. And that's really the best that we've had in the last year dealing with this pandemic. But other than that, we do have a very strong set of rules that the agencies are to follow. And we have pretty good oversight on that through our Division of Purchasing and through our Department of Administration. So we have it in rule, and then we also have it in statute, and it's very clearly defined what's required or not required. So that's what's enforced while we're not here. When we come back in January to start the session, the agencies have to report back to the Budget Committee on the contracts they entered in that previous year or something. So we do get a look at it that way, and then we follow up.
I would say that Nebraska is similar in that way. We have our biennium budget, and the departments come in, testify in front of our Appropriations Committee at the start of the biennium, and then they have their budget. We do some adjustments between the 2 years of the budget, but generally speaking, they come in and make their requests for what they're going to be doing, and we authorize the spending, but we don't really oversee the procurement process itself unless some issue is brought to our attention. And then we would have to wait until we are in session to take any action. But we are working on trying to make our procurement process a little bit more transparent to begin with. So I myself and a couple of colleagues on the Appropriations Committee have been working to that end.
And I would say in California, when we're not in session or when we had to adjourn due to COVID, there's very little oversight that can actually happen. Our legislative bodies, we insisted on establishing essentially informal committees that would meet regularly with our governors, department heads to have fairly non-public conversations about what was happening as a way of at least being informed, but it was certainly not the level of oversight I think that we would want. And maybe I'll just make one observation here that contracts and procurement are typically not very sexy topics, and they're technical, they're legal, it's hard to explain to the public. And so what I find is that the incentive for policymakers to really dive in or for staff to really become experts is just not there. And it's not until things break dramatically and end up on the front pages of the papers that folks say, oh my God, how is it that no one was doing oversight before? But I think it's a systemic challenge in general for this topic of how do you have public oversight of contracts.
Thank you all. And, I'm actually kind of looking forward to this one question that's also from State Senator Ram Villalime, because I believe he represents Illinois, and Illinois also had similar situations with their unemployment contracts. And so the question they have is, this is specifically directed to Assemblymember Chiu. What has been the public response to particularly the unemployment story that was mentioned? They have similar issues in Illinois with their unemployment system. The blame seems to be directed at government agencies, while the contracting companies are virtually unknown.
Yeah, that's been an incredible frustration on my part. The blame, I mean, the reality is we're all being blamed. Any of us who are affiliated with state government, we are being blamed for 1 million Californians who are going for months without any financial assistance from government for money that is theirs. And to the point of the question, the department itself has become a dirty word in California politics, but the contractors have been able to skate pretty free behind them. I'm probably one of the few elected officials that has been very outspoken, for example, on Deloitte and Bank of America. And there is their failure to do work, I think, not only violates their contract, but there has been some suggestion that there may have been some violations of law. But in general, the contractors aren't the ones who are blamed for the breakdown. It's the agencies themselves or the politicians. So not sure how to change that frame, but it's definitely a constant in the political discourse in our state.
Thank you. So it looks like we have another question in here. What recommendations do you have for improving legislative oversight in your state? Have there been any sort of policy approaches, anything like that?
I'll mention briefly something else that's ongoing. It's a standing committee. We have what's called JLOC, JLOC is the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee. And so that's 4 members of the minority, 4 members of the majority party. So it's split evenly. And they will solicit applications from legislators on issues that they think, topics that are important for oversight or correction. So they would question, say, contracts. We've done that before. With different types of, especially Medicaid contracts, where there's just a lot of unknowns about things. And so we have a professional staff, our Office of Performance Evaluation, that will actually do a deep dive on statutes, policies, procurement, anything like that, and they will report back to this JLOC committee, and then the report is shared with the rest of the body. And that's been a real good help for us when we have to take a hard look at some tough issues that quite honestly just take more expertise than what we have as individuals or time.
I might just jump in for a moment to say that this issue of oversight, it's not just focused on contracts, just oversight in general of how programs work. Like contracts is often, again, not that sexy to the public. And so what those of us in the California legislature have been thinking about more recently is just how do you build in, as programs are being implemented, with the type of reporting requirements that need to happen, and sort of regular updates, shortening the time periods of contracts to force them to come back through committee to relook at them, and thinking about structural ways that push the oversight function. I mentioned the unemployment system debacle in our state, and the fact that a decade ago, our employment system in California literally failed in exactly the same way it's failing right now. But because of term limits in our state, none of us knew it. And the irony was all of us in the California state legislature, we were all elected 4, 6, 8 years ago, but not 10 years ago. And when this stuff started breaking down, I literally dug up committee reports from a decade ago where you literally, word for word, it described what was happening in 2020 and 21, even though they were dated 2010. And I think the lesson to all of us is you could do oversight at one point in history, but if you don't have a way to build it into the institutional processes of budget committees and oversight committees and policy committees, it's just not going to matter. And so our colleagues at this moment, we are swearing to each other and to the public, we're going to fix the system and we're not going to allow it to be broken into the future. Fingers crossed we get that done, but we're really literally at this moment trying to figure out, well, how do we do that?
I feel everything you just said. In Nebraska, we have the added challenge of we have term limits and we're unicameral. So we don't have that institutional knowledge that maybe some people might go back and forth between the two different houses. We have one house, and so we end up relying more heavily on lobbyists than we probably should. And we also end up relying heavily on staff, but our staff, I know government salaries are amazing, but it is hard to keep staff in government jobs, especially really talented staff. So that is a huge problem in oversight. In Nebraska, we don't have an oversight committee. We do have, as Senator Johnson alluded to, we do have a performance audit committee. It's not a standing committee, so it's a special committee that just meets ad hoc. And they don't do that level of oversight that's needed. And I've been pushing for more oversight in the Nebraska legislature since the first day I arrived here, but it's not something that all of my colleagues are embracing just yet.
Thank you everyone for really great, thoughtful responses. A few more extra really great questions that are coming in here. One of them that I kind of saw was from John Lindstrom here. What kind of pushback are you getting from the executive branch in your states on any criticism or proposals to improve the oversight system?
Nebraska, I think that our executive branch would like more autonomy than I feel is appropriate. So I get a fair amount of pushback.
I think in California, what I would say, we have a Democratic majority legislature and a Democratic governor. So we are, we're all from the same party, but during this time of pandemic and recession and all the crises we're dealing with, what the administration says is, hey, our hair is on fire. Sorry that we just don't have the bandwidth to keep you apprised at the moments where we need to, because we're trying to put out these fires. And to some degree, we all appreciate that. But obviously, to another degree, we have a responsibility as oversight legislators to make sure that the fiscal, that our monies are being well spent and that programs are being well run. So it is, I think there's a natural institutional tension on that we just frankly have not resolved. And what I've wondered is when this is behind us, whether we're going to go back to the status quo, whether we can really learn from the experience of this past year plus to do things differently.
Very good. The next question I have is, Michigan is also a state with term limits. We have 6 years in the House, 8 years in our Senate. How do you suggest ensuring legislators get the instruction on the institutional knowledge they need? Feel free to say something nice about the Levin Center.
Good staff. It's really, and long-term staff is really essential. In Nebraska, we have the longest serving clerk of the legislature. He has been serving for the Nebraska legislature for over 40 years. I mean, longest in the country. And he's well known. All of your clerks probably know him. He's very well known, and he has long-term staff as well. And that's really been a saving grace for our state, is having that institutional knowledge with that staff.
I'm going to say it's a little bit of a difficult question for me to answer. Idaho does not have term limits, although I will confess the last time Idaho voted on that, I did vote for term limits, mostly because I think there are a lot of qualified and good individuals that can serve our state, and I'd like to see them have that opportunity. However, I can tell you, for example, on our budget committee, where we have gone through a few chairmen of that joint committee that we have with the House, there's quite a bit of institutional knowledge that the chairman and the co-chairman and the members of the committee bring year in and year out to that. But ultimately, it does come down, I think, to staff, and they're kind of the keepers of the knowledge, if you will. It's difficult that you're going to have time to go to the legislative library and do your research on every bill or every issue. It just doesn't happen. And so, like in Idaho, where I don't have hired staff, I have a secretary that helps me with really setting some appointments and these kind of things. But other than that, it's all on me to do the homework and or to make the contacts. So I would just say that it's a real challenge to do that. But it's just something I think that we have to be aware of, and we just have to keep our head up and just keep working and pushing. So I think Assemblyman Chiu brings up some very good points about that, you know, in terms of you learn something down the road, and it's not embarrassing so much as it is kind of frustrating to learn those things, because you spend a lot of time and energy sometimes working on an issue and you find out it's been hashed or rehashed and could have saved you a lot of effort and really the people's time and those who are trying to support. It's a challenge.
Just building on that, I in one of these hearings that we had around the debacle on our unemployment system, I literally, before telling this to the public, I read sentences that described what had happened 10 years ago, but I pretended as if I was referring to today. And then the punchline at the end was, this is dated, 2010. I would say that one of the biggest casualties of term limits has been oversight in general. And again, not just oversight of contracts, but the subject matter for a whole variety of reasons. And I would say it's not just the act of doing it, but it's the skill of how you do it. I think that folks who have been in office for more than a few years, who become much more comfortable and versed in the art of oversight are just better at it. And term limits really puts a crimp on that. And I would say in California, where most of our legislative staff are quite young and typically don't stick around in our state capital, for more than 5 or 10 years, it makes it even that much more difficult, which then suggests that, again, it's important for all of us to think about institutional reforms to really bake in oversight. We have in our California legislature a legislative analyst's office, which to some degree is a little bit of a mini auditor. And they are a source of information that's helpful in oversight. But this is where I'll just take a moment and plug the Levin Center. I think having the Levin Center or bodies like it that can spread the word to different legislators and legislatures in the importance of oversight and the skills and the art of oversight. As 26 years ago, I worked on Capitol Hill and saw the grizzled senators who could conduct the real old-fashioned oversight and really hold department heads and cabinet secretaries' feet to the fire. That's what we see on C-SPAN is generally, I think, missing in a lot of state legislatures, and I think we could all do a better job of that.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to ask about audits. Have the various oversight entities like auditors and analyst offices assisted in conducting oversight during this pandemic?
So my quick answer is yes, except audits usually take time, right? Take 6-9 months. And by the time you get the information, the challenge is how do you translate an audit into something that the public and the political world will care about? And that's always a challenge, particularly when you have hundreds and hundreds of contracts that you're trying to review. So it is a tool, but it has its limitations on how effective it can be, particularly when you are trying to move fast.
I would concur in that. Our audit department has audited some of our 2020 funds. They'll be looking at the 2021 funds, but time is needed, for some of these things to happen, and that does make it a challenge. Although earlier, Assemblymember, I shared with the panel and others about a transparency portal that the state of Idaho has, and maybe Margot or somebody at the Levin Center can share that with you. But along that line, it almost provides, in a sense, instantaneous audit of funds, because you can very quickly make a few clicks and you can find out where monies are going. You may not find out how they're being spent necessarily, but again, the review process that we have in the state of Idaho that I shared a little bit about earlier through what's called our Coronavirus Financial Advisory Committee, and it has a mixture of folks from agencies, the governor's office, and legislators. It's a pretty rigorous process. And so I think before you even get to the door of receiving funds or spending, you have to clear that committee. And then once you do, every step you take is disclosed on that transparency portal, and it's in real time. And so I think, you know, if you just kind of think of that as an ongoing audit, it's been very helpful in our state.
So I'm seeing in the Q&A, we have a question from somebody that seems to always be on every webinar I've ever been on, anonymous attendee, asking, what advice do you have for a new legislator on how to gain expertise on contract oversight issues?
Well, I like to look at our government websites. You don't have to be a legislator to do that. I go to the nebraska.gov site, and we have our agency that does most of our contracting is the Department of Administrative Services. And you know, if you've got several hours on your side sitting listening to floor debate, as I do, you can read through contracts and see what's being contracted for and who's bidding on it, and look into that process. And it mostly, as Assemblyman Chiu said, is tedious and not glamorous or sexy, but if you pay attention, you'll learn a lot, first of all, but also you will know what to look for and when to be concerned and when to just know that it's just the standard business happening.
I think you could establish, you know, a relationship, find one or two agency folks and establish a relationship with them, and ask to see a very simple contract, you know, and ask them about the contracting process and how that works, because it may be that each agency is going to do it just a little bit differently, and or depending on the vendor, it could be differently. So you think about, for example, medical care in a prison situation versus a Medicaid contract for emergency medical transport, things like that. You know, the contracts are all going to be different lengths, different details. They're going to have different requirements in them. Some of them are very easily read, probably by the average person. Others might have things in there where, you know, even the person administering that contract kind of needs to look up the rules on that. But culture some relationships with some agency folks that can help you walk through that, and then stay in contact with them, work through that. And I know for me, I've done that. I've paid visits to our different agencies, and if I've had questions about something, they'll pull it out, I'll look at it, and then it just generates more discussion and more questions. And from that, I learn. I don't learn it all, but it gets me enough information, I think, that I know where to look next time I have a question.
So I come at digging for this stuff a little differently, which is if there's a particular policy area that's on fire, that is creating a real crisis, I may often go to the broader vendor community, particularly those vendors that lost a contract to the existing contract holder, to say, hey, what do you know? What are you hearing? And they will often have a lot of great information for me about how a particular contract is not working, or what they have heard may be embedded in that contract, which then will lead me to actually pull up the right contract with the right provision to figure out what's happening. You'd be amazed at how much sort of competition in a world can sort of help you understand what government could be doing better.
Very good. Is your legislature considering policy changes that would strengthen the legislature's capacity to oversee emergency contracts or government contracts in general? Anything along the lines of sunset provisions or various oversight requirements?
I've introduced several pieces of legislation to that end, but they have not moved. When the federal dollars came to states last summer, spring and summer, we were not in session, and we were not called back into session, and therefore the governor allocated how those funds were utilized. And when we came back to finish we had a 60-day session. We had 17 days left that we came back in July and August to finish. Mostly we had to do the budget, and I did introduce an amendment to the state budget that would have us take control back over the remaining dollars. But unfortunately, from my perspective, my colleagues didn't want to deal with that. So, and then I have also introduced the same thing this year that would say that we would automatically be called back if federal dollars were to come to us in the pandemic outside of legislative hours, or days, but there is not an appetite for that in Nebraska.
I would say in Idaho, you know, we're looking at the so-called disaster emergency bills that I think many states are looking at. And, you know, we're talking about changes to that process that would allow the legislature to have a little more oversight in at least the spending of dollars. You know, we have professionals that handle the contracting portion of that. The only exception that came up was, again, I mentioned earlier about the with the constitutional officers, where they're not required to follow the same contracting laws. But when it goes through our budget process, our budget committee, they do a pretty good job of following up with the agencies and digging and finding some more of that information on why we're spending so much money, say, with one vendor. But other than that, I think really the message at this point, because we're still kind of in flux, I think, a lot of the legislatures. I think really what we're struggling with more is just enabling the legislature to have a more active role in that, or, you know, be back in session or something where we can actually provide some oversight on how these dollars are being appropriated and spent in, I guess, long-term contracting.
I would say from California, we're really not having that conversation at this point, but everybody knows that hopefully in the next couple of months, the emergency powers are essentially going to lift. And at that point, theoretically, we'll be back to business as usual.
All right. Let's see, where are we? We're at 2:07. Okay, so I will ask this question. What are some of the lessons learned from conducting oversight during this pandemic? What are the takeaways your state legislature and legislatures across the country ought to take to heart for oversight into the future?
I would say that oversight is unpopular and not glamorous and hard, and you have to have a hard stomach and a hard shell to really endeavor into it, because the intention, it shouldn't be to discover any sort of malfeasance. It should just be to ensure that integrity is being maintained. But sometimes you're going to uncover some malfeasance, and that's not going to be an easy thing to address head on. And so that can be one of the most dangerous and delicate political things for any legislator to do, is discover malfeasance and figure out a way to appropriately carry it forward. And so it's not for everyone, but I think it's a really essential piece of government. And I can't remember the rest of your question, but that's, I guess, my answer.
I'll echo the good senator's comments about it not being a particularly popular thing to do. So I serve on my body's budget committee, and I am the guy every time an IT contract that comes up that is years behind, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars behind, and I'm the guy that asks all the questions, so much that my colleagues, they kind of know that I'm the only one who'll sort of try to dig into this stuff. And I have to say, for a couple of years, we didn't really get much headway. I would do my venting and what happened. And then all of a sudden, this issue with our unemployment system broke open, and everybody understand, oh, this is the real life impact of what happens when we don't do this oversight. I think suffice it to say, the whole purpose of this panel is to say to legislators around the country just how important it is for us to do this. And I would suggest to do this together, because I suspect that a lot of the experiences that we're seeing in our individual states are not unique to those states. My guess is there are contractors out there. I will name Deloitte or Bank of America as two international companies that have been dealing with these issues, but because we're not sharing information across states, they're able to take advantage of that. And I wish there was a way for us to share more information across sectors, across states, within policy communities, so that we could all collectively hold entities accountable for how they're engaging in contracting with our different states. But the bottom line is we all, each of our legislatures need to think about how to prioritize this, how to institutionalize it, how to get better at it, and how to help the public understand why these boring pieces of paper really do make a difference.
I think well stated. And I guess to piggyback on an earlier comment, and again, you know, a plug for the work of the Levin Center. You know, transparency is so critical, so important in the legislative process, and it's real easy to go down the wrong path, you know, and or to lose sight or to lose accountability. So I think, again, the theme that I've had this morning for the state of Idaho anyway is, you know, transparency, and this, you know, helps shed some light on processes, practices, these kind of things. And then through that, you find ways to improve. So it's kind of a feedback on yourself, and you try to just make it better.
Thank you all so much. Thanks again to all of our wonderful panelists and to everyone for tuning in today. With that, I would like to bring our director, Jim Townsend, back for his closing remarks. Thanks again. Jim?
And thank you so much for doing such a terrific job moderating this panel. And panelists, you were absolutely fantastic. I learned a tremendous amount, and I think everyone listening did as well. I'll just say a couple of things just that I picked up that really jumped out at me, just to, you know, help kind of crystallize them. You know, we learned that that there are real systemic challenges in getting a focus on oversight, because yes, you know, often it's routine, it's not sexy. You know, we at the Levin Center think of oversight in a couple of different forms, and one of them is, you know, kind of cop on the beat oversight, which is oversight that's designed to keep watch on expenditures, keep watch on the carrying out of the legislature's intent, and it's designed to, in some ways, deter people from not following the legislature's intent. Then there's fire alarm oversight, and you know, obviously the pandemic and the you know, that was the ultimate you know, kind of fire, if you will, but oftentimes we don't get the oversight or the focus on oversight until there's a scandal, or until something dreadfully goes wrong, and then there's oversight. And I think what we were talking about today is, how do we build up people's interest and capacity to do oversight? Well, in both instances. In the routine sense, you know, are there things that can be done to enable lawmakers to have more resources, to be able to draw on resources that are limited, but still they're there, to help them do good oversight, you know, all the time, or, you know, on a routine basis. And then are there times when you really need to reach out and address a real emergency situation? You know, I think it's very important. I think one of the lessons of the response to COVID and the oversight that needed to be done on COVID contracts was to have some folks focusing on it. Senator Johnson, you know, pointed out that a special committee was established, not within the legislature, but outside of the legislature, to put a focus on this and to get some things in motion that would allow for greater transparency. And that seems to have paid some real dividends. You know, there was sometimes informal gatherings of lawmakers can help when you're not in session and you come together to try to keep going some of the oversight that you want to be doing. And then we heard quite a bit about term limits, about the effect that term limits can have on reducing the institutional memory within the legislature, and it's a difficult challenge, and sometimes causes folks to need to reach out to others outside the legislature to try to, you know, get some of that expertise to help remember some of the lessons of the past, so they're not so that those things aren't repeated in the future. So there was really a great deal to learn, and I think this was a tremendously engaging panel. And we at the Levin Center obviously want this to be, you know, one of many more that we do, where we're trying to, as Assemblyman Chiu mentioned, trying to bring expertise, good ideas, you know, some successes, as well as some things to stay away from in oversight that lawmakers and staff from all over the United States can really benefit from. So we're coming now to the end of our time. Again, it's been a really great experience for all of us at the Levin Center. I want to congratulate Ben and Margot as well for doing such a good job putting this excellent panel together. And I want to thank our panelists one more time, and thank all of you in our audience for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will be back in touch in the near future. Oh, one last thing, this is being recorded, so if you want to share it with others or didn't have time to listen to every aspect of it or want to come back to it, come back to the Levin Center's website and you can view a recording of this panel. Thank you so much and have a great day.